Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I'm going to talk about France's empire during the Second World War and the changes that the war brought upon the empire and the divisions between the Vichy France controlled aspects of the French Empire and those controlled by Free France. In 1939, Britain and France controlled between them the two largest colonial empires in the world. The crisis that befalls France in the summer of 1940, the invasion of France by Germany and the defeat of France, the creation of a new sympathetic fascist regime in the guise of the Vichy regime led by Marshal Philippe Pétain and Prime Minister Pierre Laval, and the withdrawal of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, create a situation that the British, fortunately for them, never have to endure, and the British Empire never has to go through. France essentially has an occupation of France, a civil war, which is only fought out on French soil after D-Day, and really prior to that it's a civil war that spans the French Empire itself. When the tide of war turned and it was clear that the Nazi Empire would be defeated and Vichy France would be overthrown, Free French military planners began to think of the future. In January 1944, the governors of the Free French Empire met in Brazzaville in French Equatorial Africa, and they began to think about the post-war consolidation of the empire. Now, I'm reading today from Fight or Flight by Martin Thomas, a book I've spoken about before. It's an excellent read, and it's the examination of the British and French empires and decolonisation after the war. He writes, with an empire racked by internal division and violence, the ebullience of French imperialism in 1945 seems puzzling. Whereas over the ensuing decades Britain would adjust, albeit painfully, to America's new global dominance, successive French governments reacted in contrary fashion, equating retention of empire with resurgent international power. It was, after all, the colonies that made Free France credible, not just as a political force, but also as a territorial entity. Particularly this is the case during the Second World War. Even though, in terms of volume and value, French colonial trade improved sharply over the course of 1944, in purely monetary terms, France's empire was not generating foreign exchange revenues comparable to the sums derived from British territories. So it was perhaps unsurprising that de Gaulle's senior advisers viewed imperial affairs in instrumental terms. In the months preceding the D-Day landings, this boiled down to one simple calculation. Colonial reforms should enhance French power, not diminish it. So the colonial reforms that the British considered in Malaya after the war, in the belief that they would hang on to Malaya, and in other parts of the British Empire, were a recognition that certain things were going to be inevitable, certain devolution, at least, of power, certain shifts towards something closer to dominion status were more likely. The British were entertaining at cabinet level, obstructed really by Churchill, the possibility of dominion status for India by 1939-1940. The French were really pedalling in the opposite direction, and the irony was that France was in a far worse shape than Britain at the end of the Second World War. So what can account for this hubris on the part of the French, the desire to stake out a place at the world's top table, when really the USA and the Soviet Union were crowding out all competitors? Well, Britain obviously had similar ambitions, if less pronounced, and perhaps slightly more realistic ambitions. The real difference between the British and the French is that the British emerged from the war with a national myth that supported the idea of the lone underdog nation fighting against all odds until the Johnny-come-latelys of the USA and the USSR came to do their bit. However fantastical that actually sounds, this is the kind of the story that the British weave for themselves. The French story is one of national humiliation, and the empire was as much about national esteem and national pride as it was about geopolitics, as it was about economics. It was about restoring the honour of France. In not Fight or Flight, I beg your pardon, in Forgotten Wars by Harper and Bailey, they talk at length about the politics of Vietnam in 1945 and the outlook of French colonists who had emerged from Japanese internment and concentration camps, often liberated by a Sikh or Hindu or Muslim soldier from the Indian Army, the British-led Indian Army, which had crossed over from Burma. And the sense of humiliation of being imprisoned by what French colonists viewed as inferior Asians, and being rescued by the colonists viewed as being inferior Asians, and then having the threat of their country being, or the country as they saw it, being handed over to inferior Asians in the guise of the Vietnamese, was too much for their egos to bear. And the knowledge that the mother country, France itself, had been overrun by the hated German enemy, meant that in 1945, France had a great deal to prove. French colonists, imperialists and militarists had a great deal to claw back in terms of national self-esteem. The meeting in Brazzaville in January 1944 was about the preservation of the French Empire and the plans that were put forward for restructuring, for economic diversification and development, and for greater electoral representation within the colonies and greater rights of the native peoples of those colonies within the empire in general, was really what we would think of as being a kind of a set of francophone initiatives. This was about creating French citizens around the world, was about making colonial subjects more French, more culturally and linguistically French than previously. Now, this had been a principle of the French Empire from the 19th century onwards, that are in line with kind of roughly with French revolutionary principles, that citizenship of the empire meant citizenship of France. But there was always a colour bar in Africa and Asia that non-white colonists, non-white colonial subjects were only able to advance so far. Their citizenship only meant so much. And the naked hypocrisy of this was one of the factors that fueled independence movements. There were a great many nationalists in Vietnam or Algeria or Sub-Saharan Africa that considered working within the empire or existing within the empire perfectly acceptable. But as the reality of official and unofficial racism became more abundantly clear, there were far more nationalists who drifted towards full independence from the empire. Martin Thomas writes, "The colonial myth that keeping empire intact was somehow pivotal to French grandeur was not confined to the Gaullist right. Despite its self-proclaimed role as arch-defender of France's historical greatness. The imperialist reflex was prevalent throughout the political community in liberated France. Even the communist leadership, rhetorically anti-colonial, to be sure, was not immune. Why? The unique circumstances of France's wartime defeat, liberation and reconstruction offer some explanation. France's acute weakness, compared with its major allies in 1945, nurtured the presumption that empire was fundamental to French recovery. So here we have an interesting state of affairs. The French Communist Party, as mentioned there, committed to decolonisation. The French Communist Party, obviously, very vociferous organisation during the Algerian War of Independence, happened a decade or so later, but was still in 1945 willing to compromise on the issue of the empire. French communists looked upon the empire as a resource too valuable to simply let go, and that there would be a flow of resources and manpower and material to France in the long run. This obviously really trampling over pretty much every ideal that the party had espoused of solidarity between workers of the world. It was clear in this instance that colonial workers were not considered as important as French native workers themselves in the eyes of the Communist Party, which betrays a staggering hypocrisy. France's actions in Syria between 1944 and 1946 tell an interesting story. The French had negotiated treaties of independence with Syria and Lebanon in 1936. However, communal unrest, which came alongside the Arab revolt against the British in Palestine, for a better story of all of that, read James Barr's A Line in the Sand, an excellent read about how the British and the French tried to mutually undermine one another in the Middle East. Anyway, so back to the point. The French used ethnic violence and anti-colonial struggles in Lebanon and Syria as an excuse in 1936 to postpone decolonisation and the transfer of power. And they continued this tactic during the Second World War. The Vichy regime and then the Free French both postponed and obfuscated the Syrian independence movement. And in November 1943, the Lebanese and Syrian parliaments both decided to declare independence unilaterally, and this made French rule in the Levant look almost impossible. In Beirut and Damascus, crowds cheered through the claims to sovereignty and refused to accept French imperial rule any longer. Even though this was, they attempted to reimpose this with immense violence. The British had no love whatsoever for their neighbours in Syria, both the Vichy and the Free French. And when the Free French government was installed, relations between the British and the Free French in Syria were pretty abysmal. They got significantly worse from July 1944 onwards, when de Gaulle established a provisional government in Paris and looked upon Britain's plans for the Middle East with immense suspicion. The British drew up a plan for a greater Syria as part of the partition of Palestine, which ceded some territory from Syria to the new divided Palestine mandate. De Gaulle flew into a rage and believed that this was a war that was being waged against the new French Republic, and that the British had double-crossed the French already. As matters deteriorated in Syria, so that the sense of French humiliation once returned, which, as we've seen so far, shaping French decision-making. The relationship between the British and the French almost completely breaks down over Syria, and this is even before the Second World War has actually ended. Attempts by the French to stave off Syrian and Lebanese independence were hampered by the British attempts in the region to accelerate the process. The British actually wanted to speed up French decolonisation because they believed the French, so hated by the Syrians, were a force fueling Arab nationalism across the region. The irony, of course, is that the Americans were trying to speed up British decolonisation over Palestine, or certainly would do a couple of years later. And so nobody really emerges from this without the accusation of extreme hypocrisy. But I suppose that's imperialism for you, really. The nationalist opposition to the French was so widespread, and Britain's military presence in Syria and in Palestine was so overwhelming that the French had very little chance of holding on, and the possibility of a shooting war between the British and the French over Syria was certainly prevalent. The French had a tiny garrison compared to the British army in the Middle East. So the hostility between the British and the French in the Middle East was one exacerbating factor, but the new imperialism of the French Fourth Republic, only a few months old by this point, was another. As we've already seen, there was enormous cross-political consensus for a revived imperial project. The British were interested overall in controlling and maintaining imperial control over the Middle East after the end of the Palestine Mandate, and the French were considered to be a force likely to disrupt this, either by claiming territory for themselves or fueling nationalism to such an extent that the entire region became unmanageable for any European colonial power. 3 weeks after the end of the Second World War in Europe, French artillery pounded the Syrian parliament building in Damascus. After weeks of clashes between the French army and the new Syrian security forces on the streets of the capital, the new self-declared Syrian government believed that its own security forces were the truest evidence of independence. The French were determined to retain control over Syria, even if the symbolic value of this far outweighed any economic gains that it could accrue. The general in charge, Ferdinand Oliver Roger, decided that the Syrians, in the language of General Dyer in Amritsar in 1919, needed to be taught a good lesson, and hundreds of Syrians were killed. The colonial troops, the French colonial troops from North and West Africa, were employed in burying Syrian dead, police and protesters in mass graves, and so it's become difficult to this day to calculate exactly how many people died. And the British Middle East Army Command, who were the ultimate military force within the region, then took full control of Syria in order to stop the bloodshed. The British Army confined the French army to its barracks, overwhelming it enormously, a source of immense resentment and anger to the French, and the imposition of martial law across Syria did something to arrest the violence, But by this point, negotiations could be put back on track for the handover of power from France to Syria, but France's actions had effectively killed the Syrian mandate dead. If France wanted to control Syria from this point onwards, it would have to do so by pouring tens, if not hundreds of thousands of troops into the country in order to pin down a national revolt, which would be ongoing. So France learned a lesson here. Well, actually, France didn't learn a lesson here, as Algeria and Vietnam would later show. But the lesson that France might have learned here was that, firstly, decolonisation would be a largely inevitable process following the crises of the Second World War. The second lesson was that France could not expect to rule colonies, a much weakened power, and could not expect to rule colonies through the barrel of a gun any longer. And thirdly, that the restoration of national pride could not be achieved realistically through a resurgent empire, but it would take another 20 years really for this to be something that that France would finally grasp. The failure of the French army at Dien Bien Phu would be the end to France's colonial dreams. But because France didn't learn these lessons, the French population at large, the French political classes, and certainly the French army and France's colonists around the world, it redoubled France's resolve to hang on in places such as Algeria and Vietnam, and they would fight far harder and for much, much longer, and be far more intransigent when it came to talks with people such as Ho Chi Minh. Syria also shows that the British had a longer game in the Middle East. They were aware that certain pieces, like the Palestine Mandate, would be taken out of play, but they knew that if they presented themselves as the protectors of the Arabs in Syria, that it would, with Arab popular opinion, look far better, and it was a way of conveniently undermining France to force France from the region altogether. And the French were not blind to this, and helped to fund Zionist terrorist gangs in the Palestine Mandate between 1945 and 1948. Okay, well, I hope you found that useful and interesting, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. Do remember to check out the Explaining History Facebook group. So if I look for the Explaining History podcast Facebook group, come and say hi, have a chat. And if you can find the time to pop by our Patreon page to fund us, we rely on a tiny trickle of advertising revenue and the generosity of our patrons. So, look forward to speaking to you all soon. Take care, all the best, bye-bye.